What do we find at the intersection of faith and the world? Our new podcast, Crossroads, explores this question in thought-provoking conversations featuring guests from around the world who are seeking to live faithfully in the public square. This is a safe space to discuss politics, technology, and our responsibilities as citizens. Pull up a chair and meet us as we search for a better way forward. Welcome to Crossroads, where we discuss the intersection of sacred and civic. I'm your host, Nygard Owens. Today's podcast topic is near and dear to my heart, women's ordination. The first 11 women were ordained in the Episcopal Church on July 29, 1974, which means the 50th anniversary of that momentous day is just a few days from when this episode first airs. Joining me to talk about women's ordination are two women I greatly admire, who themselves continue to shape the landscape of what it means for women in ministry. With us is the Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas, who serves as the Canon Theologian at the Cathedral. Kelly has been named the first canon of the Anglican Communion at the Newcastle Cathedral in Newcastle, United Kingdom. She's the author of 7 books and is a public theologian. Kelly was also the first Black woman to be ordained in the Diocese of Southern Ohio and one of the first 10 Black women ordained in the Episcopal Church. Welcome, Kelly, and thank you for your time today. Where are you joining us from?
Well, thank you for having me in this conversation, and I am joining from Liverpool, England.
Fantastic. Also joining us this morning is the Reverend Rosemarie Logan Duncan, Canon for Worship at the Cathedral. We all know Rose's work in shaping the cathedral's worship services since 2016, but Rose, like many clergy, had a different career prior to attending seminary. She earned her bachelor, master, and doctoral degrees from Howard University, and prior to her ordination to the priesthood in 2006, Rose was a church musician, clinical psychologist for DC General Hospital and the DC Department of Mental Health Resources, and researcher for the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. Welcome, Rose. It is wonderful to have you with us. And where are you joining us from today?
And I also say thank you for this opportunity to be together. I am with you from Washington National Cathedral here in Washington, D.C.
Excellent. I am at my home in Cleveland, Ohio, and it is just a delight to be with you this morning. As I mentioned in the introduction, we're having this conversation because of the upcoming 50th anniversary of women's ordination in the Episcopal Church. So I wonder, what does this anniversary mean to you all in light of your own ministry?
It's really a moment of reflection because the movement for the ordination of women was really a movement of justice that really became a foundation for a trajectory for gay clergy as well. But this is just an opportunity to acknowledge really the persistence, the courage, the hope, the faith even in their pain, the wisdom of those women and their willingness to stay in the church that really was saying, we don't want you in this role. And so they were really addressing that barrier of gender injustice. That is not what the gospel is about. So this is just a need to appreciate what they did to open the doors for so many of us who have come through to the priesthood. And it's not lost on me that this service took place at the Church of the Advocate, Black church with focus on racial justice, and now move toward gender justice and hosting this particular service. So it's a really historic moment for us to recall and to celebrate.
Yeah, first, let me echo and add, as we look at this being the 50th year anniversary of women's ordination, that's really a short span of time. And as we talk perhaps more fully about our own ministries, well, that becomes even clearer. Yet in that short span of time, right, so much has happened. Yet these women, this group of 11 women, and others, these were the women that were representative of all other women who were pushing for the ordination of women. But what does it mean? What were they doing beyond that? And what is my responsibility to that? And what is the hope? And I often say that to call ourselves church is aspirational. And what you need is always this movement within the institution that calls itself church, this movement within that church itself to push it forward to living into its own claim and its own call of church. And that often happens to those who find themselves on the underside, if you will, of justice, even within this institution that is church. And so when I think of women's ordination, this push, which takes courage, moral courage, there were risks involved, but these women did that. And so what that means for me is that I have to be accountable to that history and to that legacy, right? That it's not, oh, great, they did it, they fought for us, and so now I can just slide through and enjoy what it means to be a part of this institution. No, to be a part of that legacy is to continue to push the church toward what it claims to be.
Following up on what you said, Kelly, I am a bit younger than both of you, and I grew up and was ordained in the PCUSA, which began ordaining women in the 1950s. From my earliest years, I saw women in the pulpit, presiding at the table, and involved in all aspects of leadership in the church. So when it was time for me to discern my own ordination, I didn't have to think. I recognize what a gift their examples were to me when I was discerning that call. So I wonder, what was it like discerning your own calls as women in the ministry? Did you have examples of women to serve as a guide? And how has ordained ministry for all women changed over the years?
Growing up in the Episcopal Church, I grew up in a church in Dayton, Ohio, the only Black Episcopal church in Dayton, Ohio, St. Margaret's. And I loved going to church. I was born and raised Episcopalian. I would wake my parents when they weren't going to take me to church, much to the dismay of my other siblings, and loved the liturgy of the church, and particularly focused on the acolytes, who were all boys. And one thing that I know is taking root there, which I didn't know at the time, was, of course, this call. There are other things that impacted my call outside of the church, to the point that I would come home from church on Sundays, and we had a pool table in our basement, and I would act like the pool table was an altar, and it had a little pool cue, and use that as a crucifix, and would pretend that I was an acolyte. And racing ahead, to make a long story short, clearly I didn't have models, right? I didn't have models for an ordained ministry. I didn't even have models to participate at the altar. The only thing that women were doing in my church was singing in the choir, and even differently than men, because women had to wear a little doily or cap on their heads, right? Just to even sing in the choir, and the men didn't have to do that. Do you remember that, Rose?
Oh my goodness.
I know. You remember that, right? It's like, and I remember asking, why do we have to wear this little doily on our heads? And of course, that comes from Paul, the Apostle Paul, and taking that thing so literally. Moving forward, so when I did, one of the things that did almost stop me from even recognizing my call after women were ordained, it was not only about gender, but it was about race. And I knew that I had wider commitments to justice, and I didn't want particularly racial justice. And I said, you know what, trying to get ordained in this church is going to distract me from that. But I moved forward again. But to get to another point was when I was just on the cusp of being ordained to the diaconate. A new rector had come into my home parish. I was at seminary, and the ordination, my recognizing the call, came during my time at Union. But another priest at my parish who had to sign my papers, he came well late into the process, so this was going to be retroactive, decided that no, that's not going to happen, because he didn't believe in women in the ministry. So he stopped my ordination on the Thursday before my Saturday ordination to the diaconate. And I remember I was in New York working at the Church of the Intercession under Canon Fred Williams, who's now since passed. And I remember crying and like, oh, how could he stop my ordination? And Canon Williams, he picked me up from Union. He called me KD. And he said, KD, how many of these people out here care whether or not you're ordained? He said, if indeed you are a priest, you were called from the womb to be a priest by God. He said, whether or not the institution recognizes that call should not make a difference to whether or not you're a priest. That made all the difference to me in the world. And with all of the other barriers, you continue to move somehow toward the call of God for justice and for freedom, even within the church.
My experience was so similar to Kelly's. I grew up here in the last Episcopal colored mission established by the Diocese of Washington under segregation. That was in 1930. The initial congregation started talking in 1929, which was not a fantastic year. And so in my growing up, we were a fairly high Anglo-Catholic practicing congregation. And the rector that I grew up with, for the most part, was vehement against female women priests. To the fact that, and I've said this before publicly, and I'll say it again, that at the ordination of the Philadelphia 11, I was very aware of it because I grew up in the church. My parents were involved in it. We went every Sunday. We were there every Sunday. My mother was very involved. My father was on the first vestry, all those things. And I asked the priest, I said, how do you address these new women priests? And he looked at me and said, I don't, and walked away.
Oh.
And my experience was the same. I saw the acolytes, they were all young boys. The lay reader was a man. So there were no other examples. And the work that I did was with my mother, who was head of the altar guild. So this leads to a similar story. So we also always have those small travel communion packs. So my mother received it at home, so it wouldn't get lost in the mail, wouldn't get stolen something. So she opens it up and she leaves it to make sure everything is there. She goes someplace. I decide I'm going to play church. So I open it up. So I'm beyond playing acolyte. I have opened this up and I'm trying to remember the words of consecration. So there was something there, and it was not encouraged at all. And yes, the memory of having the hats or the mantillas or these little things, even the first female acolyte at my church had to wear the bonnet that the choir wore as she carried the cross. So there were not these examples, but what I will say is by the time, and I became an acolyte, and by 1981 or so, when the cathedral had its first acolyte festival broadly, it was a revelatory moment for me as a young woman to see these ordained women who had come through and were part of that experience. And it said, oh, there's this option. But it still wasn't foremost in my head. I had my own decisions about what I thought I was called to do. It had nothing to do with being a priest.
Well, as you all have mentioned, there are these barriers. There were barriers before women were ordained. There were barriers as they were becoming ordained in those early years. There are still barriers for women in ministry today. Most of those are unspoken. We often refer to it as the stained glass ceiling. And so, how have you all seen the stained glass ceiling at work? And what are the ways that women continue to be limited by it? And how are you seeing them break it?
Shall I go first, Rose?
Well, I'm going to say Kelly is one of those who's broken it. To some degree.
Well,
and she could talk to, on several levels, but one thing in particular is that you do not find full representation of women in the larger institution. And I mean that by looking at the number of deans of our seminaries. Kelly can talk to that, of going into the room and, maybe seeing one other person. But we also see it that churches that can actually afford associates, they're happy to have a female associate rector, but they may not be calling a woman as the rector. And for many of our cardinal parishes, those that are resourced and have high attendance, the tendency is still to call men. The whole issue of, yes, we had a woman presiding bishop, I think that misleads people because they think it's almost like when President Obama was elected, it's like, oh, racism is over. Oh, now sexism is over, even within the church. So I think the other larger piece is that of pay equity and compensation. That still exists. I experienced that myself, not at this institution, but it was someone who was an advocate who noted what was happening and helped make that change. So there's still hurdles. Yes, we've come a long way in this short period of time, but the struggle continues.
Yeah, I want to echo what your last statement there, Rose, in that the struggle continues, unfortunately, in so many respects. And this has been the case almost historically with the Episcopal Church. It was certainly the case in terms of the road to women's ordination, that society got there before the church, right? When the church should be leading the way. So, in many respects, the church was pushed by what was going on in wider society in terms of women's sort of freedoms, right? So our church continues in certain respects to reflect what is going on in our society as opposed to really pulling it forward. And so that means that the struggles that are still there for women are in some respect still there for women within the institution, our institution. Though I would like to think on some issues, yes, we are a little further. In terms of the stained glass ceiling that you talk about, I want to add a dimension. I want to call it the stained glass cliff when it comes to women of color. We talk about the glass cliff in wider society for women of color, which means that when we get, for instance, an institution, be it an academic institution or any other kind of church, typically that institution where you're asking the question, can these dry bones live? Right. So if you think that women aren't getting these sort of well endowed parishes and these cathedral parishes, if you will, then think of women of color and think of Black women. Well, we get them and the dry bones have been dry for, decades or longer. And so the stained glass cliff is if you get it, and if it continues to fail, you're blamed for it. And if it succeeds, you aren't given the credit for it. And it is telling, you see, that we can celebrate the late Bishop Barbara Harris as the first female bishop, but she was not a diocesan. She was a suffragan. And it took until 2016 for a Black female to be elected a diocesan, and she was consecrated in 2017. And that, of course, is Bishop Jennifer Baskerville Burrows in Indianapolis.
Kelly, you mentioned suffragan bishops and diocesan bishops, and I want to give our listeners who aren't familiar with those terms a little bit of context. This is something that was established in the canons that a bishop suffragan shall act as an assistant to and under the direction of the bishop diocesan. So they are not running the diocese, they are assisting the diocesan bishop. You all, you jumped ahead. I had a separate question for how is the fight for equal standing in the priesthood different for women and those of color and those who are LGBTQIA+. I don't know if you want to speak to that as well.
Well, for me, I can't separate what dimension it is because you see a Black face, I am a woman, and I'm a lesbian. And so I'm the trifecta of the things that the church has always struggled with. If you look back to the ordination of Black men, I mean, look how long it took Absalom Jones to be ordained a priest after he was a deacon. Years. And then we don't find the first Black woman until we have Pauli Murray, my shero. So it's hard because you have the Black thing, then you have the woman thing of churches not really wanting to support women priests. And then you add on the gay layer. And so for me, it's hard to tell which thing is actually coming at me. So I hold these things, I embody these things that the church has struggled with and continues to struggle with. And I'll just make this note that for my congregation, this conservative Black church, we know very often there are problems with gay and lesbian people in the church. So it's a kind of don't ask, don't tell thing. My approach was, if I'm going to go for this, then I have to be fully transparent of who I am. And that was going to be my out because I was going to say, this Black church is not going to put forward this lesbian. Even though I grew up there, they knew me there, they loved me, they raised me. And so for that to happen, for that church to put me forward was a message to me about their faith and their belief in that call. But it's really hard to tell because one of the questions I had when I got here was like, what is it like to be, the first gay woman in this thing? It wasn't about being the first Black woman. And that came from, different places. But I do believe that the work of the Philadelphia 11 provided the foundation for what would then happen for those of us who find ourselves in the LGBTQ community and our ordinations.
Mm.
Rose, I'm laughing because as you talk about, you thought you had an out, that your conservative Black parish, you say, oh, good, I don't have to answer the call because my conservative Black parish is going to say no. I did the same thing because I called my former priest of St. Margaret's. He was long since retired on a Friday evening. And I said, oh, good, Father Cochran surely isn't going to support women in the ministry, so I don't have to worry about this. And when I told him I could barely get it out, when he said, the papers are in the mail, and I'm thinking, that's not what you were supposed to say. But Rose, as you talk about Pauli Murray, Pauli Murray always said that, she was trying to really create a kind of world where Pauli Murray, the Pauli Murrays, could just be. And that's what I love about Pauli Murray in so many respects. And I agree that what the Philadelphia 11 did was they started carving a path for the church to grow into what it meant to be church. But I say in all of these issues, right, that we have to catch up with God. And that's the task here, to catch up with God. God's creation is not binary. No aspect of that creation is binary. And if we want to, as people of God, as church, began to just reflect a glimpse of the mystery of who God is and what it means to be created in God's image, then we need to get on board and catch up with God. And those who claim to have a call, who hear their call, we need to help them nurture and foster that call, because they represent whomever they may be and however they may have been created. They represent a part of who God is. It moves us closer to understanding and appreciating the fullness of God, which is appreciating the fullness of God's creation. And that ought to be the task of the church. The last thing I'll say, when people ask, what does it mean? What does it feel like to be the first gay person? Or they'll ask, what does it mean to be the first Black woman? That's always coming for folks who know, I like to say to them, what does it mean to you that I'm the first? Because those people asking the question in many respects, right, are the people that are suddenly recognizing, whoa, something new and perhaps for them challenging is happening here. I don't think we typically go into these positions. I don't know, Rose, you can answer for yourself, thinking when we're going into them, what does it mean to be the first in that way? It's more about a responsibility and accountability and understanding that other people are seeing us as the first, as we just spoke about, in the burden that holds.
And I just want to follow up on something you said earlier, when you were talking about the rector said, oh, your papers are in the mail. If the rector who had been there when I was that teenager had remained, I probably would have either left that congregation, I may have left the church, but it's the fact that someone else, and mine was Vincent Harris, who helps here as an assistant clergy.
Yeah.
And he was the one who encouraged and then saw me through that. And he continues to be that mentor and be that person. So I'm grateful for those men who were able to work it out in their heads about moving forward with women's ordination and also the ordination of those of us in the LGBTQ community. And those original bishops who stood up for those Philadelphia 11 as well.
That's right.
So it was that shift that had to happen from the men in the church.
No, that's right.
To help move this forward as well.
Mm-hmm. All right. We have had an incredible conversation. I'm so thankful for all of the history and the perspectives that you two have shared with us. And as we close, you've given some hints of this throughout the conversation. Where do you see the hope for the church, for our world, for women in particular, as we continue into another 50, et cetera, years of women's ordination?
I think I'll just say it briefly, and that is that we understand that we come to really live into and appreciate that the legacy of women's ordination in the Episcopal Church is not about women trying to get recognition in an imperfect institution, but about women trying to help that institution live more fully into what it means to be a reflection of God's just future, and that we would hold on to that legacy and make our live into an accountability that is not so much to an institution, but is to the one who called us. And that's what I will always take away from my early journeys toward the priesthood, that I was reminded that I am to be accountable to the one who called us. And I am thankful for those first 11 women, and who, telling their story, it is clear that they were accountable to the one who called them. And I hope that we can continue to do that. And if we do, as women and as priests in the church, then our church will get a little bit closer to the church it's supposed to be.
Well, she said it all. But I will say that the hope is that we have a church that accepts and includes all who find that call and who can nurture it, and for us to be supportive. For those of us who have been in, Kelly's ahead of me, I was not ordained as a priest until 2006, but those who have been before, that we see the work that they did, we appreciate all the struggles that they had, and they had severe struggles, even physical threats, that they stood firm in their faith. And that's what we have to do, to remain faithful to a God who created us all. And as we try to continue to create beloved community, that is our charge.
I recognize that as a younger woman in ministry, I am standing on the shoulders of giants. And so I want to thank you both for being strong and steady shoulders for women like me to stand on in the church, and so many others. Thank you both for your time today.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
Our next episode features an interview with world-renowned conductor Maren Alsop. Dean Randy was able to sit down with her for a few minutes before a recent concert at the Cathedral, and you won't want to miss their conversation. Thank you, as always, for listening to Crossroads, and until next time, peace be with you. If the digital offerings of the Cathedral enrich your daily life, please consider becoming a supporter today by making a gift at cathedral.org/inspire.